Hello, my name's Alison Borthwick and I'm going to talk to you today about a small-scale action research project that I've been carrying out with some teachers all about spatial reasoning. I'm currently a mathematics advisor, lucky enough to work both in the UK and with several different countries across the world. Before being a mathematics advisor, I was a primary school teacher and also into lower secondary as well. So I've actually taught from EYFS up to year 9. But today I'm going to talk to you about this research project that I've been able to carry out with some teachers. So you might be thinking, well, why spatial reasoning? And actually, you will know that for many years there's been a growing interest and a growing body of research all about spatial reasoning. So this isn't something that's new, it's been in the literature for many, many years, but we might not necessarily have heard the phrase spatial reasoning or spatial awareness. Certainly at the moment in the English mathematics curriculum, we don't necessarily see that phrase spatial reasoning. What we do see is some geometry, some position and direction, properties of shape, measure. So we might be thinking that that's connected. But certainly this isn't something that's new. But I think perhaps one of the catalysts why we are now starting to talk about spatial reasoning a little bit more is the removal of shape, space and measures from the early learning goals for EYFS children. So from September 2021, the early learning goals were changed, and so it would appear that the accountability measures for shape, space and measures, which we might also recognise as part of spatial reasoning, have gone away. And what we need to remember is, of course, that those are accountability measures and not necessarily the curriculum. But I think what that did, that policy change, was that it caused a lot of anxiety amongst educators and teachers, and so we've really started to talk a lot about, well, what is spatial reasoning, and and is it really that important? What I'd like to direct you to are two brilliant Lumen videos, one by Helen Williams, who's actually already done a brilliant video on spatial reasoning. And because Helen's has already done that video, I'm not going to talk too much about what spatial reasoning is or the types of things that you could be looking for, particularly in early years. What I'm going to focus on with this video is much more about the action research that I did with some teachers across the whole of the primary age range. The second video that I'd like to direct your attention to is another Lumen video by Sue Gifford. And Sue talks about some of the pattern action research that we've been involved in, and pattern is a big part of spatial reasoning as well. So those two videos really will complement the one that I'm hopefully going to do with you today. So let me just give you a few details about the research project that I was involved in. So first of all, it was an NCETM Maths Hub Research and Innovation Project. So what that means is that every year the National Centre offer each Maths Hub the opportunity to put in a bid to do what they're calling a research and innovation project. So I put in the bid with my hub, which is Angles Maths Hub, which supports the Norfolk and Suffolk geographical area. And we got the bid, and what that meant was that I could recruit some teachers and some schools from across Norfolk and Suffolk to come with me, to join with me and really, learn alongside, well, what do we want to investigate? What do we want to find out? I was lucky enough to be able to recruit teachers from across the primary age range. So within the group, I had reception, 2 year 6 teachers and also a teaching assistant as well. So it was a very rich group. We had 2 groups, predominantly because we were going to try and run this face to face. So a group in Norfolk and a group in Suffolk. But then the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and so we took everything online. So that was quite tricky, I have to say, but we managed. And so the teachers kind of attended whichever group they could. But usually there was about 8 participants in one group and 8 in another. So you can see that we had 6 half-day sessions across approximately 8 months, and everything was online. So what were the key outcomes for the project? Well, I'm going to talk to you about 3 different outcomes, and then kind of where we got to in terms of, we summarised it. So in terms of the professional learning for the adults, what did we want to look at? Well, we certainly wanted to enhance the subject knowledge. So we wanted to make sure that, I wanted to make sure that the teachers and the teaching assistant really knew what spatial reasoning was, and that they had command of that subject knowledge. And so to do that, we continually ask these questions such as, well, what is spatial reasoning? Why is it important? Maybe it's not important. What about the research that was underpinning it all? What key concepts, what do we mean when we say spatial reasoning? What are we actually talking about mathematically? And then how can we promote it? Should we promote it? So those are the types of things that we were looking at in terms of the professional learning for the participants. In terms of then taking that into practice, and also there was a leadership element there because one of the teachers was also a maths subject leader, and occasionally a couple of the head teachers from the schools would drop in as well. Mainly because it was online, it was a really good opportunity for them to do that. So there was the possibility of influencing policy at a different level as well. So we were looking at teachers really reviewing their practice, being that reflective practitioner and thinking, so we're going to try something in the sessions that they had with me, and then how could they take that back into their classroom, and of course what was the impact then going to be on pupil outcomes. And that was really interesting because I would do one task, but I would have reception to year 6, so we would then talk about, so how can you adapt it? What do you need to think about? What's suitable? Do you need to contextualise it for your children? We also kind of were starting to look at, well, does it correlate? Is there some match between spatial reasoning and mathematical performance? Because as I'll share with you a little bit of the research, and the research says, yeah, there is. So we said, well, the research might say that, but is that actually true? So we started to look at that. And then we also drew on quite a lot of international studies that were kind of on things like children's spatial language, that geometrical reasoning, that visualisation, mental rotation going on, and also some numerical data as well. So it was very rich. And as I say, we had 6 sessions. They were half days, but we really did kind of go to the wire. We made sure that they were sort of 3.5 hours long each. So we did have quite a good amount of time. So what we were able to do, I'll talk to you about the pupil outcomes as well before I say something else. So the third kind of big outcome was, well, what does this all mean for the children that we're teaching? So we kind of anticipated that the pupils would have that greater exposure just because the teachers were coming out to the sessions and then trying things back in the classrooms, so that hopefully those pupils would be able to start to apply some of those skills across all of their mathematical thinking, actually. That's what we were aiming to do. We really went to town on visualisation skills. So spatial reasoning is made up of all of these different elements, but visualisation is a particularly key element. So we did a lot of practice, we did a lot of tasks where we were really strengthening, I guess, our visualisation skills. And so we wanted to see whether that improved with the pupils, and also improving kind of those reasoning skills by having to explain. So that communication, being able to collaborate, being able to talk to one another. And then also, we wanted to see whether there was anything in terms of attitudes. Could we motivate pupils more? Could they have more fun? Could they have a positive attitude? Could they have that growth mindset? That idea about being able to have a go, to have perseverance and resilience, and certainly that communication. So it was quite a tall order. That's kind of, and I wrote those outcomes and then kind of presented them to the teachers and said, what do you think? And they said, oh, it's quite a tall order there. And I was like, yeah, okay, well, let's see how we go. And it really was a very genuine, we'll all learn together. I would read some research, design the session, and then we'd all kind of talk about it and what we thought. And then the teachers would come back each session and say, well, I had a go at this, or yeah, I did that, and I'm not sure about, can we chat about it? So it's a real collaborative research, mini action research project. So we decided that actually we needed to summarise those 3 pages of outcomes. So we kind of had these 4 questions. So, is spatial reasoning a predictor of later achievement in maths? And you'll see when I share the research in a minute that the research says it is. So we said, well, let's give it a go. What do we think on the ground? Is it effective in enabling children to achieve better than actually they would? So children who don't necessarily have exposure to spatial reasoning, do they do less well than those children that do? Does it improve those attitudes and also that access to maths? Does it do something? Does it draw children in? Can we tap into different things that they're thinking, that they're reasoning? So we were really kind of going both content and skill in terms of mathematics. And finally, what about the curriculum? I mentioned earlier that in the English Maths National Curriculum, the phrase spatial reasoning, spatial awareness, it doesn't appear. So we do have kind of, these silos of, well, here's a bit on shape and space, or here's a bit on measures. So does it do something to the curriculum? So I promised that I'd give you a flavour of the research, and I will. And what happened with each of those 6 sessions is that I would share different parts of the research each session. So in effect, we were building up our knowledge of the research that was out there as we went. But these were some of the key bits of research. And again, do go back to Helen Williams's video, because she draws on the research a little bit more. So I don't want to necessarily repeat it here. But certainly, I've mentioned that, the research says that spatial skills can predict mathematics attainment. And when I shared that with the teachers, they were a bit stunned actually, and to be honest, a little bit sceptical, because they said, well, really? How is that possible? So we can look at children who are in early years, for example, and we can look at how well they do with spatial awareness, spatial reasoning, those spatial skills. And basically, if they're doing really, really well, then that's an indicator of how well they will do towards the end of primary. And that's amazing. And you kind of think, well, if that's what the research is saying, and it does bear out, then we need to be doing a lot of spatial reasoning in the early years, and particularly Key Stage 1. And you can see the research references that are on the screen. So this isn't just one piece of research. There's a number of research studies that are saying this. That idea that actually those processing skills are actually scaffolding that mathematical development, which is also why we had that outcome connected to the curriculum. So again, the research by the 2 researchers on the screen kind of said that actually there's something going on there, that spatial reasoning is supporting and scaffolding other elements of mathematics, and in particular that mental rotation. So some of the things that we're doing in our head that actually will improve children's arithmetic performance. And that's also the link back to why the research is saying that spatial skills predict later mathematical attainment, because it's not about doing number to get better at number. We do have to have number sense, but the research is saying, well, actually, if we do a bit of number, but we also do some patterning, but some spatial reasoning, then actually those are other really strong indicators. I think it's fair to say we don't quite know why spatial thinking is linked to number, although we did see a little bit of evidence, which I'll share with you as we go through this, as some of the connections with number lines, for example. But again, we think it's as it says there, that it is that number is being mentally represented in several different ways. So for example, when we roll a dice and we think of the number 5, the number 5 on a dice is represented in a spatial way, but then we could think about where and how number 5 looks like with a pneumacon tile or a Cuisenaire rod or on a number line. So again, what the spatial awareness side of it is doing is presenting something else. Again, we had Sinclair and Bruce. We looked at their research that was suggesting that the spatial reasoning is important for understanding maths. So again, strengthening what we've just been saying. And also the idea that kind of those, we think of maths, maths is a very abstract subject, isn't it? So we bring it to life with the conceptual understanding. So using lots of manipulatives and representations. And Giles and co were connecting that grounding in kind of that interaction with objects and that physical space with the abstract understanding that we need for number. So some really good literature references there if you are interested. And the very last slide at the end of this video just gives you a summary of all of those references if you want to go and find them. Okay, so back to the project. So how did we collect the data? Hopefully you've got an idea now of what we did. So we collected the data from both, I collected the data from the teachers and the children. I have to say it was mainly qualitative, little bit of quantitative data, but we weren't really after kind of, big stats. We were really after kind of thinking about the qualitative nature. So, things like, I would observe what the participants were doing, saying, not saying, when they attended the Zoom sessions, lots and lots of informal comments. But also a big thing is that right from the beginning, I set up the task that in our very last session, I did about half of the presenting, and then I handed it over to the participants, and they did a mini presentation where they pulled together the most pertinent things for them, including some of the impact, and I've woven that throughout this session for you today. What did we do with the children? So we actually baselined the children and we gave them 6 tasks, and I'm going to share with you what those tasks were in a minute and some of the reactions. And I took those tasks from lots of the literature. So I've put up the 3 main sources of literature that I used to generate those different tasks. We had the idea at the beginning about being able to carry out the tasks with another class who were then not going to have the input with the spatial reasoning. And we were all very excited about that, but unfortunately COVID intervened, so we weren't able to do that. So kind of, from the children's point of view, we looked at their work. The teachers were so enthusiastic about bringing the work back, and often, we'd go off on these amazing kind of tangents where one of the teachers or the teaching assistant would bring something back, and then we'd all be really excited about it and we'd talk about it, and then we had to remember we had another 50 slides to get through or whatever. So lots of children's work, lots of their comments. The teachers were very good at capturing verbatim what the children were saying. We had some videos from children, so that was amazing as well, but also observations. And let's not underestimate, the importance of, being able to observe the children doing these things as well. So just going back to the teachers, kind of, I guess what you might call a mini teacher baseline, is at the very, very start, we did some introductions on session 1. Before I said anything, I said to all of the participants, okay, so what's spatial reasoning? Type in the chat box what you think. So I was able to gather exactly what they were saying. So I thought I'd share that with you. So in no particular order, being able to explain and show some shapes in relation to each other, explaining in the environment, me thinking that my car is far wider than it is, therefore cringing when driving through narrow spaces. And she put on the end, poor spatial reasoning. And actually one of the things that we learnt very quickly is that spatial reasoning is malleable. So I think we all decided at the end of the project that our spatial reasoning had improved dramatically. But I love the fact that actually some of the teachers were thinking about kind of where it was in the curriculum or what they were doing in practice, and others were thinking how it affected their day-to-day lives as well. Somebody else said is it an awareness of position and direction? And somebody else said, I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure. Is it to do with visual reasoning? Because we've heard all of these words, haven't we, before? So that's what they said. So let's have a look at the baseline tasks that we did with the children. So I offered 6 baseline tasks that the teachers could choose from. Some of them did all 6, some of them did 3 or 4. It really, I have to say, COVID really impacted a little bit because, you know, the teachers were in and out of the classroom at this point. So sometimes they were face to face, sometimes they had to go back online because bubbles had closed. And they did amazing. You know, I think one of the things that I took away from this project was their unwavering commitment. There was just no way that they were giving up. And I think that just showed a real excitement and hunger to learn about this. So they were able to choose however many tasks they wanted. They were also able to choose how many children. You know, I was really cautious and I said, look, you could pick 6 children. You could have 2 novices, 2 apprentices, 2 experts, or you could do it with the whole class. Entirely up to you. I let them choose, with the caveat that when we finished, just before session 6, they were to repeat exactly the same tasks with exactly the same words that they used and instructions with exactly the same children. So that was the only thing that they had to think about, and they all did that, which was brilliant. So here was number 1. Again, they're not in any particular order. So the teachers were able to choose one of the squares on the slide. Some of them did all 4 of them, some of them just did 1. But the idea is that you show children one of the squares for 10 seconds and then you hide it, and then you ask the pupils to try and draw it from memory. So I'll just show you a couple of things that the teachers said. So one said, so my children drew a box within a box. And she said, why? Why did they do that? So she was referring to the first one, where you've kind of got the window. So she showed the children that, and they just didn't see it. So she was really perplexed on that one. Another teacher showed the children the second square in, where you've got the diagonal lines. And she said, one of mine just put a tiny X in a large square, totally ignoring the spatial dimensions. So that was really interesting, kind of how those children, what did they see? What did they choose to notice? And what did they choose to attend to? And what did they choose to ignore? So again, really, really interesting. But I have to say, the teachers were like, what? Why did they do this? We had no idea that they couldn't copy. And actually, one of the things that we found out in the research, and this was linked to the pattern project that on a separate note I was doing with Sue and Helen Fowlis, was that we read that actually copying is quite hard. And I think as teachers we all think, oh yeah, copying's quite easy, but actually it's a pretty hard skill. And this was demonstrated with this task. Second task, so that the teachers gave the pupils a number line. Now I really wanted to do a task that wasn't shape and space orientated, because the research was suggesting so many links between spatial reasoning and numerical skills, and particularly that mental arithmetic computation. So we picked up this task in some of the research. So the teachers were chose a number line. So depending on the age, remember I was doing this from reception to year 6, so they could choose the parameters. They then chose between 3 and 5 numbers that they told the children to place on the number line. They weren't to give them any clues, and they said that was really hard actually. They said one of the things that came out was that they're scaffolding less. But they said, but the children learnt more by scaffolding in a different way and not over scaffolding. Actually, the children became more resilient and actually a little bit cleverer at kind of trying to decide what the teachers were doing. So that was a really interesting outcome actually from the research. So this is what one of the teachers said. She said, the children just, it was like we hadn't ever done number line. She said, we taught it a few weeks ago, but when I gave them the numbers, they just couldn't do it. So that's something interesting going on there, isn't it? Year 1 teacher, she said, my year 1 children just bunched all of the numbers together. And again, the teachers were like, Why did they do that? So that was really interesting. School P, so they had year 5 and year 6 children in this project. So you can see that they said to the children, we'd like you to draw a number line between 0 and 1. They gave them those 4 numbers that are on the screen. Now, the pre-baseline task, the teacher said most of the children put the numbers in the correct order, but they were all bunched together. There was no kind of thinking about, well, you know, what's the space, you know, the proportional space between the numbers. They then did a whole load of stuff on number lines over the 8 months. And when they came to retest the children, she said, again, almost all were correct. But this time, most interestingly, the numbers were much better placed. And she said, actually, what happened when we then transferred number lines into calculations, the children were stronger at calculating using the number lines because of the work that that she'd done on spatial reasoning. At task number 3, the children were shown that shape. I guess it's a chair. We said it was a chair, actually, to contextualise it for the children. But we said it's been made up from different shapes and asked the children what they could be. And the children were actually given it as a paper copy and they could draw on the chair. That one teacher, she said, they just did really strange things. She went on to say they just drew inside the shape. So again, completely ignoring the spatial parameters. And I remember when we had the session, she said, what's going on? Why are they doing that? And again, we realised that actually that composition and decomposition of shape, she said, oh yeah, I don't actually think we've really thought about it. You know, we were kind of doing the standard, here's a shape and what is it called, and let's describe the properties, but actually, you know, decomposing and then composing shape, she said, yeah, I don't think I've really done that. So going back to those professional outcomes, that subject knowledge for that teacher was really enhanced. And you know, and then as a result, she did lots more. School L, so this teacher said when the children did it pre-baseline, they used quite basic shapes like a square and an oblong. Then she did lots of composing and decomposing work. And then afterwards, same task, but the children were much more adventurous. So they could see things like trapeziums and isosceles triangles. So we were very excited about that, I have to say. At task 4, so the children were shown these 2 shapes simultaneously. So they were showing them together and they were just asked, which takes up more space? Is it A? Is it B? That's literally, that was the question. Across the board, the teachers said either children got it or they absolutely didn't. And you might say that, but they, you know, it wasn't just that a particular year group kind of was divided. We couldn't say, well, actually children in early years and key stage 1 were not as good as children in key stage 2. Actually, in every class from reception to year 6, some children were like, it's the same amount of space, and others were, oh no, it's definitely A. Hardly any of them said it was B. They all kind of, if they had to choose between one, it was always A. So that was really, really interesting, hence that comment from one of the teachers that she'd done it with a few of the year groups. So School L, again, it was quite high when they did it pre-baseline, the pre-baseline, pre-test. 80% said they were equal, but 20% said A. When they did it again at the end, that had gone up. 92% said they were equal. 8% still said A. And of course, you know, we could say, well, that's just natural development over those 8 months. You know, we can't say it's as a direct result of the work, but certainly the teachers were very much more aware of spatial reasoning and exposing the children to it. School S, again, at the beginning of the project, 75% of the children said it was equal, but you know, at the end of the project, that had gone up to 92%, and that teacher was particularly pleased. And I know that she did a lot of work, and we did lots of work on squared paper and isometric paper, as well as using different shapes as well. Task 5, again, going back and bringing in a little bit of the pattern element that sits within spatial reasoning. The children were presented with those two patterns. Usually the first pattern, almost all of the children got it, regardless of where they were in the school in terms of age and phase. The second one was much trickier. And so you can see there that, that one of the teachers said that most of them answered that second question incorrectly, and because they were able to rotate. They could not rotate the triangles. Even when they were turning their head onto the side, they really struggled to see what was going on with that pattern. And again, that is borne out in the research, that mental rotation and that visualisation are key skills within spatial reasoning. And then the final task, and this was probably more aimed at early years and Key Stage 1, but I have to say that, again, all of them did it as well. So it was really interesting. I mean, the Year 6 teacher said, well, I just thought I'd have a go. I'd just see what they said. So again, School L, before the project started, quite a lot of children mixed up which was their left and their right hand. But at the end, all of them except one were correct. And again, we could say that that's natural progression for those children, but certainly the teachers were claiming a lot of spatial reasoning ground at this point. So what did we do over the sessions? Well, I've already mentioned that every session had an element of research. Every element had some tasks, and that was to enable us to really unpick what the skills were, what the components were of spatial reasoning. So we were able to say, well, let's have a go at this and then go and try it out in the classroom. So there's just an example of some of the things that we did. So quite a lot. We did quite a lot. And of course, we then had those presentations at the end of the project. So I just want to pick out two of the tasks that were an absolute hit, and that the teachers are still talking about kind of at the moment. So one was pentominoes, and I've just popped some pentominoes for you on the screen in case you're thinking, I know what that is, but I just need a quick reminder. And so we asked things like, well, how many different pentominoes are there, and what shapes can you make? And then finally, can you fit all 12 pentomino pieces together to make that rectangle? And there was a lovely video that we watched, and the teachers, I'd sent all of the teachers some pentominoes to cut out, and we literally sat there, on the Zoom screen, kind of having a go and trying to fit them together, and they absolutely loved it. And you can see 3 different examples of pupils' work at the bottom of the screen there. And this was one of those activities where particularly one of the participants was doing this online. So she'd made this amazing video that she sent home for the online learning, and quite a lot of the children videoed themselves completing the task. I mean, that was just amazing. You hope for those kind of things, and it was just, we almost couldn't keep up with the speed of with the excitement and enthusiasm with the children. So this was from one Year 5 girl. She said, and we watched this video. And she said, now, I'm going to talk to you about my thinking because it looks different, but it's the same block. And while she was talking, she was rotating and she was saying, and I'm really curious about how to get this one in. And it was just a lovely piece of video. If you could video children thinking and reasoning, that's exactly what we captured there. And that particular teacher was thrilled with that. And it just kept on going. The class they wanted to do more and more and more on pentomino. So that was a real hit. And the other one, and again, I was surprised at this one because we did pentominos first, and then we did tangrams in the next session. And I thought, well, I don't know whether, we've already done pentominos, we've done 2D shapes, but I wanted to do tangrams. And again, they loved it, absolutely loved it. And that was both teachers and children. So again, I'd sent a sheet with tangrams to cut out. So the teachers came to the Zoom session with the tangrams, or if they'd already got some of them had some very posh wooden ones. And we sat there and we talked about what the shapes were and what they were called. And it was a real kind of looking at composing and decomposing. And then I put up a few images. I've put 2 of them on the screen for you and said, well, can you make them? And the teachers were like, yeah. And then about 5 minutes later, they were like, no. and again, we were kind of like, how is it this hard? What is it that we're doing? And so it, doing the tasks really enabled us to then deconstruct what was going on kind of in our mathematical minds, and what skills were we doing, and what subject knowledge did we need. So that was, again, a lovely, lovely task. And this is kind of what some of the teachers said. So one of the year 2 teachers said, what I started to do with this task was, she said, I stepped back and I wanted to see how they would approach it. And that was lovely, because one of the things that the teachers started to talk about was, not only was their subject knowledge increasing, but their pedagogical content knowledge had also started to change. So, they'd gone from over scaffolding, but realising that they were over scaffolding, to then starting to step back and allow the children to have a little bit more freedom, to take some risks. And we talked actually quite a lot about those pedagogical changes. Interestingly, look at that second bit on the screen. What we started to notice, and it kind of was coming out in the research, but it took a few sessions for us to see this in practice, was that the children who the teachers would label as kind of being the better mathematicians or the more able, were actually not more able with spatial reasoning. And we then started to look out for that more. And what we noticed was that spatial reasoning was starting to close the gap. So it was harder to see who were the more able and who were the less able to use that terminology. And that was very powerful, and very exciting. And again, one teacher, she said, one of my girls really struggles with maths, doesn't want to do any of it, kind of just doesn't seem to be able to see the maths. Absolutely loved it. And we also used Tangram Cat. Now, if you haven't read Tangram Cat, I apologise now, you will have to go and get it. It is amazing. And I think, that again was a different pedagogical stance of bringing a different type of way of teaching the maths through a story into the lesson, and the children just absolutely loved it. So in terms of that collection of evidence, I've already said, I think we had some qualitative and a little bit of quantitative. We did the pre and post baseline tasks. Lots of conversations. We had the chat box going. I've also got a Mentimeter snapshot to show you. We did a bit of Menti. If you haven't seen Menti, it's an online platform that you can type comments into. We had lots of work and comments and some videos from pupils, and also those presentations from participants. So, you might be saying at this point, well, what did the children think? Well, it was amazing. I mean, we've got a little bit of work there on the screen, but they would say things like this, this is impossible, but I really want to do it because it looks so cool. You just can't buy that, can you? It was just lovely. And the teachers were just, if they could have run to the Zoom session, I think they would have run to that Zoom session. They were so excited to share these things with each other. And one of the children said, well, it's not maths, is it? And that idea that actually we were doing something that looked a little bit different, that they were excited, but it was hard, but they wanted to do it. So if you remember, we had those 4 questions that I'd kind of summarised from those 3 screens. We had those 4 questions. So I'm just going to show you some of the impact related to those 4 questions. So taking that first one, is spatial reasoning a predictor of later achievement? It is too early to tell, definitely. We would need to track those children for a few years. But if you ask the teachers, anecdotally, they would say yes. They were absolutely convinced. So I think that's really interesting, and certainly would be a really, really good research project to do over a longer period of time. Being able to do some of those tasks, those baseline tasks, and then 2, 3, 4 years down the line, be able to say, those children were really good at spatial reasoning, and look at where they are now. So the second question, is spatial reasoning effective in enabling children to achieve more highly than they would have if they didn't have access, or if they weren't enabled to think explicitly about spatial reasoning? Well, this is what the teachers said. One of the teachers said, some children, and particularly the girls, and that's interesting because Clements and Sarama have some research about this, but they said they are now choosing more spatial reasoning tasks. So particularly in early years and key stage 1, when tasks are left out, what the teacher was noticing is that more children are going to the spatial reasoning tasks, and more of those children are girls as well. Another teacher said, again in early years, that as a result of the things that we were talking about, the pedagogical changes, she's now setting up her continuous provision differently, and she showed us some pictures of kind of before and after, and she said as a result more children are accessing it. So that was really interesting. So the way that she'd thought pedagogically about including spatial reasoning within her continuous provision as well as direct teaching, now more children were being effective because they were accessing it more. One of this year 4 teacher was she was amazing. She actually got quite emotionally upset on the last day because she was so overwhelmed at the impact that this project had had. She works in a very tricky school, lots and lots of deprivation, a very high percentage of children with pupil premium. And at the end, just as their normal summative end of year data, she'd done a kind of just a generic maths test. And she said 63.6% of my children are expected or above. She said, never before have I ever reached something like that. And she was absolutely adamant that it was a direct correlation to the work that she'd been doing. I thought that was interesting. She said, I wish I'd done a more comprehensive baseline. Next year, she said, next year I'm definitely going to do this. And it's going to be really comprehensive. I'm going to do it with all of the children. I'm doing all 6 tasks. So I thought, it was lovely to feel that, the teachers were inspired by doing some action research. She also said, because we pushed her on this, because, we said, well, come on, what is it? What can they do that's better? And she said they're much stronger at place value. And she had done a lot of work on the number lines. She'd picked up lots of the composition and decomposition tasks with shapes. She'd also done quite a lot on the visualisation, but she'd done lots on number lines. And she said, actually, I used to do number lines and I'd forgotten, about how powerful they were. And this had made her remember and realise. And that's what she also said, that the children who had improved the most in spatial reasoning had also made the most progress mathematically. And she was off to governors, to governors to talk about this and really get it across the school. So she was a real advocate. The other 2 questions, so does it improve access and attitudes to maths? All the teachers said, yeah, absolutely, that it unequivocally. But in particular, things like the tangrams were a hit. We had lots of parents and carers accessing the task, really, really loving them. So, I think it's fair to say both children and adults loved the task and just able to really enjoy maths. It was lovely to hear that during the pandemic, lots of these children had been accessing maths and working with their adults at home on things like tangrams and pentominoes, and they were loving it. Another teacher said, yeah, I think it does. And particularly for this teacher, the 2 elements that she has really taken away from the project is the collaboration and language. She said that's been really, really successful. Another teacher said that children are choosing spatial reasoning tasks during wet play. So she said, we always put out a range of tasks when it's wet play time. But she said, I hadn't really thought to put out the jigsaws and the puzzles. And she said, I am, and the children are loving them. And then finally, that other question, well, does it improve the maths curriculum? Remember, it's not in the English national curriculum. So, if we're going to do this, we're going to have, those teachers needed to take ownership and really mould their curriculum for their needs of their children and their context. And all of them said, yeah, absolutely. One of the schools was going to work on implementing a spatial reasoning learning trajectory across the whole school from reception through to year 6. Another one said it's really improved that use and computation with number lines and also that positional language. So the teachers kind of were going away already wanting to alter policy as well as practice. That's just a snapshot that I promised you a little bit earlier on of the Menti. And you can just see some really lovely things there that the teachers were saying. So I said, how has your subject knowledge and teaching practice changed as a result of the project? And they said, they definitely use the tasks earlier. So many more things that they want to do now with their children. Seen dramatic improvements in teamwork, confidence, reasoning. I mean, these were things that we hadn't necessarily expected. They certainly weren't in the outcomes, the original, project outcomes. So some really nice kind of comments there. And then just a few little quotes that I wanted to share with you. So interesting to see who have spatial reasoning and who don't yet, because we know that it's malleable. Other things that came out, the year one teacher said, I can't believe they're so rubbish at drawing shapes. I didn't really think about, having to give them time and development to draw shapes. But she said, what this has shown me is that I absolutely need to. That collaborative work, really understanding what spatial reasoning is, just can see a dramatic difference. The idea about giving one activity for all, they couldn't quite, that idea that we would just have one activity for reception to year 6 and we just modify it. And we just think about, well, how can we use it across the board? How can we differentiate it? And they said, it's amazing. We don't need these, all of these levels of differentiation. Again, made me realise I'm going to do more collaborative work. And I thought that was a really nice comment. I came into it a bit sceptical, now totally converted. So I think, it's had impact on lots of different levels. It has impacted on those professional outcomes for the teachers. It's definitely impacted on the practice and in the leadership. But really importantly, it impacted on the pupils. They all said that they could see the benefit of including spatial reasoning within mathematics learning, within the mathematics curriculum. But more importantly, they said they think it had really helped the children's mathematical ability. And that was lovely. And this idea about that it was closing the gap. And that's phenomenal. That's astounding. So one final slide to share with you. So kind of at the end of the project, we sort of went away and the teachers are still in contact, but I was offered the opportunity to guest edit the primary mathematics journal for the Mathematical Association. And I've just popped the reference on there if you want to have a look at it. And so I kind of thought, well, this is an amazing opportunity to have a themed issue all about spatial reasoning. So that's what I did. And Helen Williams and Sue Gifford and lots of other amazing colleagues have contributed to articles. But so did the teacher and the teaching assistant in this project. And so I just wanted to kind of, end this presentation celebrating them really, and all of the teachers that were involved in this project, because they all came to it, none of them had done any research. They were a bit sceptical about spatial reasoning, and they said, well, we don't really know how to go about research. And we just talked about, it's about having an idea, having a question, going and investigating it, and then having a little think about it and drip feeding in a bit of the research as well. And they all did it. And so Sam is the teacher and the subject leader at Lavenham Community Primary School, and she wrote about the journey that she went on. And that's in the article to read. And the teaching assistant, Sarah Grimmer, also wrote about her experience of coming to the sessions and what she did within her role as well. So I think that's an amazing place to finish. And really, they are representative of all of those teachers that were in the group. So those are the references if you're interested. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been of use. I hope it's inspired you to do a little bit of research, but also to have a little bit of a think about spatial reasoning. Thank you very much.